My finger hovered over the red button on my banking app, the only steady thing in a world that was currently spinning out of control. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of what I was about to do. On the brightly lit stage, my father Otis was clutching the microphone, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "Get this beggar out of here!" he bellowed, his voice booming through the speakers. The crowd of 300 elite guests erupted in laughter, a sound that felt like physical blows against my skin. In the front row, my mother Beatrice smoothed her silk dress deliberately, looking away as two burly security guards gripped my arms, their fingers digging into my flesh. They thought they were throwing out the trash. They thought they had finally crushed me. They had no idea that the phone in my hand was connected to the central deed registry of the county. They didn't know that with one single tap, I wasn't just leaving, I was foreclosing. I looked at my father one last time, watching his arrogant grin, and I let the tears fall, because I knew they were the last tears I would ever shed for these people. I took a breath that tasted like iron and cold air, and I pressed execute. My name is Sophia, and at 32 years old, I have spent a lifetime being the stain on my family's perfect picture. They think I am a failure because I don't wear their logos or drive their least luxury cars. They don't know that while they were building debt, I was building an empire of distressed assets. Before I tell you how I turned their 40th anniversary into a homeless shelter application, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And please hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to protect you. Secrets come with a price, and my family was about to pay theirs with interest. The nightmare began 4 hours earlier. The sun was beginning to set over the Atlantic, casting long golden shadows across the driveway of the Vantage Point estate. It was a sprawling 5-star venue that my father had rented to announce his legacy. I arrived in an Uber, sitting in the back seat and checking my emails. My own car, a modest sedan I kept for appearances, was in the shop, and I saw no reason to waste money on a limousine just to impress people who already hated me. As the car idled at the massive iron gates, I felt that familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I stepped out of the car, thanking the driver. I was wearing a black slip dress. To the untrained eye, specifically my family's eyes, it looked like a simple, boring rag. They wouldn't recognize the vintage Italian silk or the fact that it was tailored by the same hands that dressed royalty in Monaco. I liked it that way. I liked moving through the world like a shadow. "Excuse me, miss." The security guard stepped out of his booth, his hand resting on his belt. He looked me up and down, his lip curling in a sneer as he took in my lack of jewelry and my simple clutch. "Staff entrance is around the back. Deliveries and kitchen help need to use the service road." I didn't blink. "I am not staff. I am a guest. My name is Sophia Brooks. My father is the host of this event." The guard let out a dry, mocking laugh, checking his clipboard without really looking. "Brooks, huh? Funny, Mr. Brooks told us his daughter would be arriving in a Bentley. He didn't mention anything about an Uber. Look, honey, I don't have time for groupies or crashers. Turn around or I am calling the cops." I was about to pull out my ID to dignify him with a response when the roar of an engine cut through the air. A bright red Porsche screeching to a halt right behind me. The door flew open and out stepped Jessica, my sister-in-law. She was a vision of chaotic wealth, draped in a gold sequined gown that cost more than most people's college tuition but looked like it came from a discount costume shop. Her blonde hair was teased high, and her fingers were weighed down by rings that I knew for a fact were bought on credit. She spotted me instantly, and a wide, predatory smile stretched across her face. "Oh, thank goodness. Sophia." She didn't hug me. She didn't say hello. Instead, she thrust her hand out, dangling her car keys in my face. "You are here early. Perfect timing. The valet stand is backed up and I cannot be late for the red carpet photos. Be a dear and park this for me, will you? And please, Sophia, for the love of God, be careful. This is a Porsche, not whatever rust bucket you are used to driving." The security guard smirked, crossing his arms. "Told you she was staff. I stared at the keys dangling in front of my nose. The disrespect was so casual, so practiced. Jessica didn't even see me as a person. I was just a convenient utility, something to be used and discarded. She was already turning away, adjusting her dress, assuming I would obey. I reached out and snatched the keys from the air. Jessica beamed, not looking at me. "Thanks, sweetie. Try not to scratch it." She took a step toward the gate, the security guard stepping aside to let her pass. I turned to the guard, locked eyes with him, and tossed the keys high into the air. They sailed over his head, landing with a splash in the decorative fountain next to the guard booth. The silence was instant. Jessica spun around, her jaw dropping as she watched her electronic fob sink to the bottom of the water. "Oops," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "I guess I am not qualified to drive such an expensive car after all." "You little witch!" Jessica screeched, rushing toward the fountain, her gold dress trailing in the dirt. "My fob! Do you know how much that costs to replace?" I didn't answer. I adjusted my silk clutch, looked the security guard dead in the eye, and walked past him through the open gate. He was too stunned to stop me. As I walked up the long marble driveway toward the main hall, I could hear Jessica screaming at the guard to fish her keys out. It was a small victory, a petty one, but it felt good. I didn't know then that this was just the appetizer. The main course was waiting for me inside, and it was going to be much harder to swallow. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the lion's den, unaware that I was the one bringing the fire. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the main ballroom, and the blast of air conditioning hit me first, followed immediately by the overwhelming scent of lilies and roasted lamb. The interior of the estate was even more ostentatious than the exterior. My father Otis had clearly spared no expense, or rather he had spared no expense on credit. The room was bathed in a golden hue thanks to the crystal chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen fireworks. A string quartet sat in the corner, sawing away at Vivaldi, their music barely audible over the roar of 300 guests, trying to outshout one another. I paused at the top of the short staircase that led down to the dance floor, taking a moment to survey the kingdom my father claimed to rule. It was a perfect tableau of African-American high society, or at least the specific slice of it my parents desperately wanted to belong to. There were the bishops and pastors in their tailored suits, their wives in elaborate church hats that defied gravity. There were the local business owners, men my father called partners, but who I knew were actually creditors he was trying to charm into extending his loan terms. And in the center of it all, standing near a towering pyramid of champagne glasses, was Otis himself. He looked impeccable, I had to give him that. He was wearing a midnight blue tuxedo with a silk lapel, a glass of sparkling cider in one hand, and a microphone in the other, though he wasn't using it yet. He was holding court, his booming laugh echoing off the marble walls. I watched as he slapped the back of Councilman Jenkins, leaning in to whisper something that made the politician nod vigorously. My father was selling a dream. He was selling the image of the Brooks family dynasty, an empire built on faith and hard work. Only I knew that the foundation was made of quicksand, and the only reason they hadn't sunk yet was because I had been secretly shoring it up for years. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my dress, and began to descend the stairs. Heads turned as I walked. I could feel the eyes on me, heavy with judgment. In this room, success was measured in carats and brand names. My understated black silk dress, which cost more than the councilman's car, was interpreted as the uniform of the defeated. I heard the whispers ripple through the crowd. "Is that Sophia? She looks so plain. I heard she is still struggling in the city. Poor Otis having a daughter like that, while Marcus is doing so well." I kept my chin up, fixing a neutral smile on my face. I wasn't here to correct them, not yet. I navigated through the sea of round tables covered in white linen, looking for the head table. Traditionally, at events like this, the immediate family sat together on a raised platform at the front of the room. It was a display of unity, a visual confirmation of the family hierarchy. I saw the long rectangular table set for 6. My father's seat was in the center, flanked by my mother, Beatrice. Next to them were seats marked for Marcus and Jessica. And then there were 2 empty chairs on the end. I made my way toward the platform, assuming one of those seats was mine. I was the daughter, after all. The scapegoat, yes, but still blood. However, before I could even reach the first step of the dais, a hand clamped down on my upper arm. The grip was tight, the fingernails sharp. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The scent of gardenia perfume was suffocatingly familiar. Sophia. My mother hissed, her voice low and dangerous. I turned to face Beatrice. She was wearing a silver gown that shimmered under the lights, her makeup flawless, hiding the stress lines around her eyes that I knew came from dodging debt collectors. She was smiling for the benefit of the room, a wide, fake grin that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Hello, Mother," I said, keeping my voice even. "I was just looking for my seat." Her grip on my arm tightened, pulling me slightly off balance. She leaned in close, pretending to kiss my cheek, so she could whisper directly into my ear. "You are not sitting at the head table, Sophia." I pulled back slightly, looking at her. "Excuse me." "We have important guests tonight," she said through her teeth, still maintaining that frozen smile. "Investors who are very interested in Marcus's new venture. We need those seats for people who actually contribute to this family's future, people who matter." The words stung, familiar as they were. It was the same song she had been singing since I was 12 years old. Marcus was the investment. I was the expense. "So where am I sitting?" I asked, my patience thinning. She released my arm and gestured vaguely toward the back of the room, past the VIP tables, past the friends of the family, past even the distant cousins who only showed up for free food. "Table 19, she said dismissively. "It is over by the kitchen service doors." "Try to stay out of the way, Sophia. Today is about your brother. Don't cast your usual dark cloud over his celebration with your sullen attitude." She patted my cheek, a gesture that looked affectionate from a distance, but felt like a slap up close, and then turned on her heel, gliding away to greet the mayor's wife. I stood there for a moment, processing the humiliation. It wasn't just that they didn't want me at the head table, it was the specific geography of my exile. I turned and walked toward table 19. The further back I went, the dimmer the lights seemed to get. I passed the tables with centerpieces of fresh orchids and imported roses. By the time I reached the back wall, the centerpieces were smaller synthetic flowers that looked plastic even in the low light. Table 19 was a small, wobbly round table pushed dangerously close to the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. Every time a waiter burst out with a tray of appetizers, a gust of steam and the smell of dish soap washed over the seats. But the final insult wasn't the location. It was the company. I pulled out a chair, the metal legs scraping loudly against the floor, and looked at the other occupants of the table. There was no family here, no friends. Sitting to my left was a young man with a heavy camera bag at his feet, checking the display on his DSLR. He looked up at me, confused. "Are you the backup event coordinator?" he asked, taking a bite of a bread roll. "No," I said, sitting down and placing my clutch on the table. To my right was a woman in a headset holding a clipboard, clearly the stage manager for the evening. Across from her were 2 teenagers looking bored, wearing vests that matched the catering staff. I was sitting at the vendor table. My parents had seated their 32-year-old daughter, a senior partner at one of the most powerful private equity firms in New York, with the hired help. To them, I wasn't a guest. I wasn't family. I was just another logistical, unchecked box, something to be tucked away in the corner where I wouldn't ruin the aesthetic. The photographer looked at me again, noticing my dress. "You are a little overdressed for staff, aren't you?" I picked up the water glass in front of me. It was visibly smudged, unlike the crystal goblets at the head table. I looked across the room, over the sea of heads, to where my father was now taking his seat, laughing as Marcus poured him a glass of wine. They looked so happy, so secure in their little bubble of delusion. "I am not staff," I told the photographer, my voice calm, almost amused. "I am the landlord." He frowned, not understanding. "The landlord? I thought Reverend Brooks owned this place." I took a sip of the lukewarm water and smiled. A genuine smile this time. Because sitting there at the vendor table listening to the clatter of dishes from the kitchen and watching my family preen like peacocks, I realized something. They had put me in the back so I wouldn't be seen. But from the back of the room you can see everything. You can see the cracks in the plaster that the expensive lighting hides. You can see the way the waiters roll their eyes when my mother snaps her fingers at them. And most importantly, you can see the exits. I checked my phone under the table. The app was open. The file was ready. Enjoy the bread rolls, I told the photographer. It is going to be a very long night. Just then the music swelled. The string quartet transitioned into a triumphant fanfare. My father stood up tapping the microphone, the feedback screeching slightly before settling. The room went quiet. It was time for the show to begin. And from my seat at table 19, I had the best view in the house for the fall of the Roman Empire. The master of ceremonies, a local radio host hired for his booming baritone, tapped the microphone to silence the room. It was time for the presentation of gifts, a tradition my family treated with the solemnity of a coronation. This was not about generosity. It was about performative wealth. It was about proving to the room that the Brooks dynasty was thriving even if the bank accounts told a story of impending ruin. My brother Marcus was the first to rise. He adjusted his silk tie, shooting a wink at a table of young women near the front, who giggled in response. As he walked toward the stage, the spotlight followed him, bathing him in a halo of artificial glory. He moved with the swagger of a man who had never been told no, a man who believed the world owed him its applause simply for existing. Otis stood center stage, beaming with pride, his arm draped possessively around my mother's waist. Marcus bounded up the stairs, taking the microphone with practiced ease. "Mom, Dad." He started, his voice thick with feigned emotion. "You gave me everything. You built this legacy from the ground up. And now that I am stepping into the role of CEO, I want to give you something that matches the speed at which we are going to take this company to the top." He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. With a dramatic flourish, he flipped it open. Inside sat a car key. Not just any key, but the heavy, distinctive fob of a Mercedes-Benz S-Class. The room gasped collectively. A murmur of admiration rippled through the crowd. "It is parked right outside," Marcus announced, pointing toward the entrance. "A brand new S580, for the man who drives our family forward." Otis let out a sob, a loud theatrical sound that echoed through the speakers. He grabbed Marcus in a bear hug, burying his face in his son's shoulder. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, looking at the crowd to ensure they were witnessing this perfect family moment. My boy Otis choked out into the microphone. "My son, this is what legacy looks like. You are the greatest blessing God has ever given me. You are the future." The crowd erupted in applause. People stood up clapping for the dutiful son. From my seat at the back, near the kitchen doors, I watched the performance with a dry, bitter taste in my mouth. I knew that key. I knew that car. I had seen the credit inquiry on Marcus's report just 3 days ago. He hadn't bought that car. He had leased it with a predatory interest rate that would balloon in 6 months. And knowing Marcus, he had likely forged my father's signature as a co-signer because his own credit score was in the double digits. The car wasn't a gift. It was a liability wrapped in chrome and leather. It was a 48-month financial shackle that he had just publicly locked around my father's ankle, and my father was weeping with joy for the privilege. The applause eventually died down, and the MC returned to the mic. And now, he said, his voice dropping slightly in enthusiasm, "We have a presentation from the couple's daughter, Sophia." There was no fanfare, no swelling music, just a polite, scattered applause that sounded more like rain falling on a tin roof. I stood up from table 19. The walk to the stage felt like crossing a desert. The click of my heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the room. I could feel the eyes of the guests boring into my back, dissecting my plain dress, wondering why I looked so stark compared to the glittering peacock that was my brother. I carried nothing but a small, cream-colored envelope in my hand. It was flat and unassuming. It didn't sparkle. It didn't scream wealth. But inside that envelope was the deed to the one thing my mother had cried about losing 5 years ago. It was the redemption paperwork for Grandma Dorothy's emerald brooch and heirloom that had been in our family for 4 generations before Beatrice quietly pawned it to cover a gambling debt Marcus had racked up in Vegas. I had spent 6 months tracking it down, negotiating with a private collector in Atlanta, and buying it back for 10 times its value. It was meant to be a peace offering, a sign that despite everything, I still honored our history. I walked up the stairs. My father had already stopped crying. He looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance, as if my presence was interrupting the high of Marcus's gift. Marcus was leaning against the podium, smirking, twirling the Mercedes key around his finger. "Happy anniversary," I said quietly, reaching out to hand the envelope to my mother. Beatrice looked at the envelope with disdain. She didn't reach for it. She looked at me, then at the crowd, then back at me, her eyes pleading with me not to embarrass them with something cheap. Before my mother could touch it, a hand with manicured red talons snatched the envelope from my grip. It was Jessica. She had stepped up from the side of the stage, unable to resist inserting herself into the moment. "Oh, Sophia." Jessica laughed, her voice shrill and amplified by her proximity to the microphone. "What is this? A heartfelt poem? Or maybe a coupon for a free hug? You really shouldn't have." She held the envelope by the very corner, shaking it as if it were contaminated. "We just got a Mercedes, sweetie," she continued, playing to the crowd. "I think we are good on greeting cards. Maybe we should just put this with the rest of the trash so it doesn't clutter up the stage." She made a motion to toss it onto a side table where empty glasses were being collected. The crowd chuckled. A low, cruel sound of amusement at the poor, struggling daughter trying to compete with the golden sun. Something inside me snapped. Not a loud, violent snap, but the quiet, decisive click of a lock turning. I reached out and caught Jessica's wrist before she could let go of the envelope. My grip was iron. I felt her pulse jump under my fingers. The laughter in the room faltered. The smile dropped from Jessica's face as she tried to pull her hand back, but I held fast. I stepped in close, invading her personal space, forcing her to look me in the eyes. My face was calm, terrifyingly calm. "You should be very careful with that." "Jessica," I said, my voice low but perfectly audible to the family standing frozen around us. I tightened my grip slightly, watching her eyes widen in shock and pain. "That envelope contains the only thing in this room that is actually fully paid for," I whispered, though the silence in the room carried my voice further than I intended. "And trust me when I tell you what is inside, that paper costs more than your life." I released her wrist abruptly. Jessica stumbled back a step, clutching her hand, looking at me as if I had just pulled a knife. Otis stepped forward, his face turning purple with rage, realizing I had just threatened his daughter-in-law and insulted the atmosphere. But before he could shout, before he could call security, I turned and walked away. I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't wait for a thank you. I walked back down the stairs with my head high, leaving them holding the envelope like a ticking time bomb. They didn't open it. They were too busy staring at my back, wondering for the first time all night who exactly had just walked off their stage. They thought I was jealous. They didn't know I was just finalizing the audit. I walked away from the stage with the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, drowning out the murmurs of the confused guests. I needed air, but more than that, I needed a fortress. I turned sharply and pushed through the heavy oak doors of the ladies' powder room, locking the main door behind me for a split second, just to breathe before realizing I couldn't keep it locked. I moved deeper into the room, past the velvet fainting couch and the wall of gilded mirrors, seeking the sanctuary of the furthest stall. I didn't need to use the toilet. I just needed a wall between me and the world. I sat down on the closed lid, my hands shaking as I clutched the envelope I had tried to give my mother. The deed to Grandma Dorothy's brooch felt heavy, a symbol of a bridge I had tried to build only for them to set it on fire. I was just about to stand up and splash some cold water on my face when the main door to the restroom slammed open. The sound echoed off the marble tiles, followed by the aggressive click-clack of high heels. I froze. I knew those footsteps. "You have got to be kidding me, Beatrice," a voice hissed. It was Jessica. The sugary sweetness she used in front of the cameras was gone, replaced by a tone that was sharp enough to cut glass. "Keep your voice down," my mother whispered harshly. "The acoustics in here are terrible. Anyone could hear you." I held my breath, pulling my feet up slightly so they wouldn't be visible under the stall door. My heart, which had just begun to slow down, kicked into overdrive. "I don't care who hears me," Jessica snapped. The sound of her purse hitting the marble counter told me she was reapplying her lipstick, probably checking her reflection for cracks in the facade. "Did you see that little stunt your daughter pulled? Threatening me? Saying the envelope was worth more than my life. She knows something, Beatrice. She has that look in her eye. She doesn't know anything." My mother dismissed the sound of running water filling the silence. "Sophia is dramatic. She always has been. She is just jealous because Marcus is the star, and she is... well, she is Sophia." She was probably trying to give me some sentimental garbage like a framed photo of a cat. "Ignore her. Ignore her." Jessica's laugh was cold and devoid of humor. "I can ignore her. What I can't ignore is the fact that the check for the catering deposit bounced this morning. The manager cornered me before I went on stage. He said if the balance isn't cleared by midnight, they are cutting the power. Do you understand how humiliating that would be?" I blinked, processing this. My father was throwing a six-figure party, but the check for the food had bounced. "I told you I handled it," my mother said, her voice dropping lower, vibrating with a tension I rarely heard. "I transferred the funds an hour ago. It just takes time to clear." Transferred from where? Beatrice Jessica demanded. "I know the business accounts are empty. I saw the statements on Marcus's desk. You are overdrawn on 3 lines of credit." There was a long pause. I pressed my ear against the cold metal of the stall divider, straining to hear. "I liquidated the asset," my mother said finally. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the tiled room it sounded like a gunshot. "Which asset?" Jessica asked, her tone suspicious. "You said everything was leveraged." "Your mother's house?" Beatrice replied. "The property on Elm Street." My blood ran cold. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Grandma Dorothy's house. The small Victorian cottage with the wraparound porch where I had spent every summer of my childhood. The place where I had felt safe. The place where Grandma had sat me down 3 days before she died and told me explicitly that the house was mine. She had left it to me in her will, a safe haven for when my parents eventually pushed me out. But when the will was read, my parents claimed there was a clerical error, that the house had to go into the family trust for tax purposes. I had believed them. I was young, and I trusted them. "You sold the cottage?" Jessica asked, and for a second I thought she sounded shocked. But then she continued, "How? The title has been tied up in probate for years because of that dispute with Sophia's claim." "I forged the signature," my mother said. She said it so casually, as if she were talking about signing for a package. "I have been practicing Sophia's signature for months. I signed the quitclaim deed last week, transferring her rights to the trust, and then I used the property as collateral for a hard money loan. We got $300,000 this morning. That covers the party, the lease on the Mercedes, and a little extra for your shopping trip." I felt like I was going to be sick. My mother hadn't just stolen from me, she had committed a felony. She had stolen the last piece of my grandmother's love, the only physical legacy I had left, and she had turned it into a party for the brother who tormented me. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and angry, but I forced them back. Now was not the time to cry. Now was the time to act. With shaking fingers, I pulled my phone from my clutch. I opened the voice memo app. I prayed the button wouldn't make a sound. I pressed record. Well, thank God for that. Jessica sighed, the tension leaving her voice. "But listen to me, Beatrice. 300,000 is a band-aid. It fixes tonight, but it doesn't fix the real problem." "What problem?" my mother asked nervously. Marcus owes money to people who don't send letters, Jessica said, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He has gambling debts, Beatrice. Big ones. And he leveraged his share of the company to cover them. If we don't come up with $500,000 by next Friday, they are going to break his legs, and more importantly, they are going to come after my assets because I am his wife. My mother gasped. 500,000, Jessica, we don't have that kind of liquidity. Then you better find it, Jessica snapped. Look, I like being a Brooks. I like the status. I like the potential. But I didn't sign up to be the wife of a cripple or a pauper. You have 1 week to figure this out. Sell another property. Sell the jewelry. I don't care. But if that money isn't in Marcus's account by Friday, I am filing for divorce, and I will take half of whatever dust is left of this empire. I am not going down with this ship, Beatrice. I will not be married to a failure. I can't believe this. My mother sobbed softly. After everything we gave him, stop crying and start thinking, Jessica commanded. Fix your face. We have to go back out there for the cake cutting. And for God's sake, keep Sophia away from the investors. If she opens her mouth about anything, ruin her. We will. My mother sniffed, regaining her composure. She is nobody. No one will believe her anyway. The sound of heels clicked toward the door. I waited until the heavy swoosh of the door closing signaled they were gone. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the waveform on my phone screen. It was still recording the silence. I stopped the recording and saved the file. I named it The Confession. I stood up and unlocked the stall door. My legs felt steady now. The shaking had stopped. A strange calm had settled over me, a cold metallic clarity. I walked to the sink and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the scared daughter who had walked in here 5 minutes ago. That girl was gone. She had died the moment her mother admitted to forgery. The woman in the mirror was a CEO. She was a shark. She was the owner of Helios Capital, and she had just been handed the ultimate weapon. I reached into my bag and pulled out my lipstick, a deep blood-red shade I rarely wore. I applied it carefully, watching my lips transform. They wanted to play games. They wanted to talk about leverage and assets. Fine. They had no idea that the nobody they were mocking was the one person who could authorize the check they so desperately needed. But I wasn't going to write a check. I was going to write an ending. I smoothed my dress. I checked my teeth. I picked up my phone and forwarded the audio file to my personal attorney and the district attorney's fraud division. The game has begun, I whispered to my reflection. I turned and walked out of the restroom, not back to table 19, but straight into the war zone. They wanted a show I was about to give them, a finale they would never forget. Back in the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to manic. The string quartet had been replaced by a DJ who was blasting upbeat jazz, a desperate attempt to keep the energy high and the conversation flowing. Waiters were circulating with trays of filet mignon bites and lobster tails, but I noticed the pace had slowed. The open bar, which had been flowing freely for the first hour, was now hesitating. Bartenders were double-checking inventory lists and looking nervously at their managers. I stood near the pillar by the kitchen doors, watching the slow-motion train wreck that only I knew was happening. My brother Marcus was in the center of the room holding court with a group of potential investors. He was laughing, his head thrown back, that new Mercedes key fob still clutched in his hand, like a talisman. He looked like the picture of success, the heir apparent to a thriving empire. But I saw the tightness in his jaw. I saw the way his eyes darted around the room, not making contact with anyone for too long, as if he were afraid they would see the fraud written on his soul. Then I saw him, the banquet manager. He wasn't a waiter. He was a serious man in a sharp black suit with an earpiece coil running down his neck. He moved through the crowd, not with the grace of service, but with the determination of a debt collector. He beelined for Marcus. I watched as the manager stepped into Marcus's circle. He didn't smile. He leaned in close, whispering something directly into my brother's ear. I didn't need to be a lip reader to know what was being said, but from the sudden pallor that washed over Marcus's face, turning his skin an ashy gray, The message was clear. The credit card had been declined. Marcus pulled back, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a cough. He patted the manager on the shoulder a little too hard, trying to dismiss him. But the manager didn't move. He stood his ground, whispering again this time, pointing discreetly toward the bar, where the premium scotch was being poured. Panic is a funny thing. It strips away all the polish and pretense, leaving only the raw animal instinct underneath. Marcus nodded jerkily, excusing himself from the investors with a wave of his hand that was trembling visibly. He turned away from the group, his smile vanishing, instantly replaced by a look of sheer terror. He wiped a layer of sweat from his forehead, his eyes scanning the room frantically. He wasn't looking for our father. He wasn't looking for his wife. He was looking for a lifeline. He was looking for me. Our eyes locked across the crowded room. I didn't look away. I didn't smile. I just watched him. For a split second I saw the hesitation. He hated me. He had spent the last 2 hours ignoring me, mocking me, and letting his wife humiliate me. But desperation has no pride. He started walking toward me, weaving through the tables, ignoring the guests who tried to stop him for a chat. He reached me and didn't say a word. He just grabbed my elbow, his grip hard and bruising, and steered me toward the service corridor that led to the kitchen. "We need to talk," he muttered, pushing open the heavy swing door and dragging me into the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. The noise of the party faded, instantly replaced by the hum of industrial refrigerators and the clatter of dishes. Marcus spun around to face me, blocking the exit. Up close, he looked like a wreck. The confidence was gone. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and beads of sweat were trickling down his temple, staining the collar of his expensive shirt. "I need money," he said. No preamble, no greeting, just the demand. I looked at him calmly, crossing my arms over my chest. "Excuse me. Don't play dumb with me, Sophia," he snapped, his voice cracking. "The card machine is down. It is a glitch or something. The bank put a hold on the corporate account for security reasons because the charge was too high. I need to give them another card to keep the bar open." "A security hold," I repeated, keeping my voice flat. "Is that what they told you? Or did they tell you that the account is overdrawn by $40,000? Marcus flinched. "How do you know that?" I ignored the question. "I don't have a credit card that can cover a $20,000 bar tab, Marcus. I am just the poor sister, remember? The one with the fake business card." Marcus took a step closer, invading my personal space. The smell of expensive cologne mixed with fierce sweat was nauseating. "Cut the act," he hissed. "I know you have money stashed away. You have been living in that tiny apartment in the city for years, driving that piece of junk car. You don't spend a dime. You probably have a savings account just sitting there. I need $10,000. Right now. Transfer it to my personal account or give me your debit card." I stared at him, marveling at the audacity. He truly believed he was entitled to my labor. In his mind, my frugality existed solely to serve his excess. $10,000, I said slowly. "You want me to give you $10,000 to pay for alcohol that you are pouring down the throats of people who think I am a failure?" "It is a loan," he said quickly, his hands twitching. "I will pay you back next week, as soon as the investors sign the check. I swear on my life, Sophia, just give me the money. If the bar closes now, everyone will know. Dad will have a heart attack. Do you want to kill Dad? Is that what you want?" The emotional manipulation was clumsy and familiar. It was the same weapon he had used since we were children. "I don't have it, Marcus," I lied. "And even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you. You are a grown man. You just leased a Mercedes. Surely you can pay for a few drinks." The lie hit him like a physical blow. His face twisted in rage. The desperate brother vanished and the bully returned. He lunged forward, grabbing my wrist with both hands, twisting it painfully. "You are lying," he snarled, spitting the words at me. "You selfish little brat. I know you have it. You always have to be the martyr, don't you? You want to see me fail. You are jealous because Dad chose me. You are jealous because I am the CEO and you are nothing." He shook my arm violently, my shoulder popping in its socket. Give me the card, Sophia. My career is on the line here. This party is the only thing keeping the creditors away. My career is more important than your pathetic little savings. I looked down at his hands gripping my wrist. I felt the pain radiating up my arm, but I didn't pull away. I let him squeeze. I let him show me exactly who he was. This was the golden child. This was the future of the Brooks family. A man assaulting his sister in a service hallway because he couldn't pay for his own vanity. "Let go of me, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was dangerously low. "I am not letting go until you give me the money." He shouted, his spit landing on my cheek. "You owe me. You owe this family. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. Now do your job and support us." At that moment, the door to the kitchen swung open. A waiter walked out carrying a tray of empty glasses. He stopped dead seeing the altercation. Marcus froze, realizing we had an audience. He released my wrist instantly, pushing me back against the wall, as if I were the one who had attacked him. "You are useless," he hissed, straightening his jacket and smoothing his hair. "Absolutely useless. Don't bother coming back inside. Nobody wants you there anyway." He turned and stormed back toward the ballroom, leaving me alone in the hallway. I rubbed my throbbing wrist, looking at the red marks his fingers had left on my skin. The physical pain was sharp, but the clarity it brought was sharper. He said his career was more important than my life. He said I owed them. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I looked at the bruise forming on my arm. "You are right, Marcus," I whispered to the empty corridor. "You do have a career to worry about, but you are wrong about one thing. I don't owe you anything. But you owe the IRS, you owe the bank, and as of this morning you owe me." I opened my banking app again. I wasn't going to transfer $10,000. I was going to transfer ownership. The financial crack had just become a canyon, and I was about to push him into it. The silence in the service hallway was heavy, broken only by the hum of the industrial refrigerator and the throbbing pulse in my injured wrist. I leaned back against the cold tile wall, taking a moment to breathe, to center myself. I thought I had a moment of peace, a moment to recover from my brother's assault, but the universe had other plans. The swinging door flew open again with such force that it banged against the wall, leaving a dent in the plaster. It was my mother, Beatrice. She didn't look at my red, swollen wrist. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't notice the way I was cradling my arm, or the fear that was just beginning to fade from my eyes. All she saw was her precious son storming back into the party, looking distressed, and in her mind there was only one possible cause for his unhappiness: me. She marched toward me, her silver gown rustling like the scales of a snake. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. I straightened up, preparing for a lecture, preparing for the usual guilt trip about how I needed to be more supportive. But Beatrice was past words. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, her hand lashed out. The sound of the slap was louder than anything I had heard all night. It cracked through the narrow hallway, a sharp, violent report that echoed off the tiles. My head snapped to the side. The sting was immediate and blinding, radiating across my left cheek like fire. I tasted blood where my tooth had cut the inside of my lip. I stood there frozen, my face turned away, waiting for the tears. I waited for that familiar well of hurt to rise up, that desperate inner child who just wanted her mommy to love her. But as the seconds ticked by, I realized something profound. The tears weren't coming. The hurt wasn't there. The well was dry. In its place was something cold, hard, and incredibly sharp. "How dare you?" my mother hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you upset him?" I saw his face, Sophia. He was shaking. He is the CEO of this family. He carries the weight of our entire legacy on his shoulders. And you selfish, petty little girl, you are back here deliberately trying to break him. She grabbed me by the shoulders, shaking me. "You want to ruin this night, don't you? You can't stand to see him shine. You are so jealous of his success that you would sabotage your own flesh and blood just to make yourself feel better. Well, I won't let you. I will not let you destroy what we have built. She released me, shoving me back against the wall. She held out her hand, palm up, her fingers twitching with demand. Give it to me. I slowly turned my head to look at her. My cheek was throbbing, likely already bruising, but I kept my expression perfectly blank. Give you what, mother? I asked, my voice steady, devoid of any emotion. Your card, she spat. Your salary card. Your savings. Whatever pittance you have managed to scrape together in that city. Marcus needs liquidity to keep the bar open. If the investors see the service stop, they will think we are insolvent. I will not let that happen because of your stinginess. Give me your wallet. Now. I looked at her outstretched hand. It was the hand that had fed me, bathed me, and just now struck me. It was the hand of a woman who would burn her daughter alive to keep her son warm. I slowly reached up and wiped the trickle of blood from the corner of my mouth. I looked her dead in the eye, and for the first time in my life I didn't see a mother. I saw a liability. No, I said softly. Beatrice's eyes widened in shock. Excuse me. I said no. I repeated, stepping away from the wall, standing to my full height. And mother, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to etch it into your memory. Because that slap you just gave me, it didn't fix your problem. It just cost you $12 million. Beatrice stared at me for a second, her mouth hanging open. Then she let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. $12 million, she scoffed. Have you lost your mind? Has jealousy finally driven you insane? You don't have $12, let alone 12 million. You are delusional, Sophia. You are sick. She didn't wait for a response. She was done asking. Like a feral animal cornered, she lunged for the small silk clutch I was holding in my uninjured hand. I didn't fight her. I let her take it. I watched with detached fascination as my mother, the elegant Beatrice Brooks, tore open my bag like a common thief. She upended it, shaking the contents out onto the dirty floor of the service hallway. My lipstick rolled under a cart. My phone landed face down. A few mints scattered across the tiles. And there, landing with a heavy metallic clink, was a single card. It wasn't the bright blue debit card from a local credit union she was expecting. It was made of anodized titanium. It was matte black, heavy and sleek. It had no numbers embossed on the front, only the name Sophia Brooks laser etched in silver, and the distinct silhouette of a centurion in the center. Beatrice froze. She looked down at the card, her brow furrowing. She bent down and snatched it up, turning it over in her hands. She was looking for a Visa logo, a bank name, an expiration date. She was looking for something she recognized from her world of maxed-out store credit cards and leasing agreements. But the Centurion card, the true black card, speaks a language she didn't speak. It is a card invited only for individuals who spend millions annually, for people who own the banks, not the people who owe them. To Beatrice, it looked like a prop. It looked like a piece of metal I had ordered online to pretend I was someone important. She looked at the card, then up at me, her expression shifting from confusion to absolute disgust. "What is this?" she sneered, holding the card up between two fingers. "A library card. A membership to some goth club. There are no numbers on it, Sophia. It is fake. Just like you. Just like your life." She didn't know that the card in her hand had a spending limit that didn't exist. She didn't know it could buy the entire hotel we were standing in with a single phone call. She didn't know she was holding her salvation, and she was too ignorant to recognize it. She threw the card at me. It hit my chest with a thud and clattered to the floor. "You are useless," she spat, wiping her hands on her dress as if touching my property had dirtied her. "Absolutely useless. Fix your face and stay back here. If you come out there and embarrass us again, I will have security drag you out by your hair." She turned and stormed back toward the ballroom, desperate to find another way to cover the lies her son had told. I stood alone in the hallway for a long time. I looked down at the black card lying on the dirty tile next to a discarded napkin. I slowly bent down and picked it up. It was cold against my skin. I dusted it off and placed it back in my bag. Then I picked up my phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. I unlocked it and opened the app. I saw the pending notification for the property lien. I saw the control panel for the building's electrical grid. She called me useless. She said the slap cost nothing. I tapped the screen authorizing the transfer of ownership. The loading wheel spun for a second, then turned green. Transaction complete. I looked at the door my mother had just exited. "You are wrong, Mother," I whispered. "That slap was the down payment, and now I am coming to collect the rest." I walked back into the ballroom just as the overhead lights dimmed, plunging the room into a dramatic, hushed twilight. The only illumination came from a single intense spotlight trained on center stage where my father stood. He had recovered remarkably fast from whatever panic Marcus had instilled in him regarding the bar tab. That was Otis Brooks's greatest talent. He could be drowning in debt standing in the rubble of his own poor decisions and still convince a room full of people that he was walking on water. I slipped quietly into my seat at table 19, the wobbly vendor table near the kitchen. The photographer next to me gave me a sympathetic look, noticing the redness on my cheek, but he said nothing. He just zoomed his lens in on my father, ready to capture the lie. Otis gripped the podium with both hands, his knuckles gripping the wood as if it were the helm of a ship steering through a storm. He looked out over the sea of faces, letting the silence stretch, manipulating the tension in the room like a maestro. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. 40 years, he began, his voice thick with a carefully practiced emotion. 40 years ago, Beatrice and I started this journey with nothing but a prayer and a dream. We didn't have handouts. We didn't have investors. We had faith. We built this company brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, because we wanted to leave something behind that would outlast us. We wanted to build a legacy that would stand as a testament to what a Black family can achieve in this country when they refuse to bow down. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Amens and hallelujahs rose from the tables where the church deacons sat. My father nodded, accepting the praise feeding off it. "But a legacy is not just about buildings and bank accounts," he continued, his voice rising in volume. "It is about stewardship. It is about knowing who has the strength to carry the torch when your hands get too old and too tired to hold it high. It is about recognizing the spirit of leadership in the next generation." He turned his gaze toward the head table where Marcus sat. My brother had composed himself. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling a glass of water, looking every bit the prince awaiting his crown. "My son Marcus Otis," said his voice cracking with theatrical pride. "Stand up, son." Marcus stood, buttoning his jacket, soaking in the applause that erupted. "This man," my father boomed, pointing a shaking finger at him. "This man has been by my side through the fire. He understands the cost of greatness. He understands that to lead you must serve. He has the vision, the drive, and the heart of a lion. He is the angel God sent to ensure the Brooks name rings out for another 100 years." The applause was deafening. I sat motionless, my hands folded in my lap. I thought about the angel who had just twisted my arm in the hallway. I thought about the visionary who leased a car he couldn't afford to impress people he didn't like. The hypocrisy was so thick it was almost suffocating, but the room drank it up. They saw what they wanted to see. Then the music shifted. The triumphant underscore faded into something more somber. My father's face grew serious, almost pained. He looked down at the podium for a moment, then slowly lifted his eyes. The spotlight seemed to widen, searching the darkness of the room until it found the back corner, until it found table 19, until it found me. "But the Lord does not only send us angels," my father said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was amplified to every corner of the room. "Scripture tells us that the Lord also sends us tests. He sends us thorns in our flesh to keep us humble, to remind us that not every seed we plant will bear fruit." The room went deadly silent. Heads turned. 300 pairs of eyes followed the beam of light twisting in their seats to stare at the back of the room. I felt the heat of the spotlight hit my face, illuminating the red mark on my cheek for all to see. "I have 2 children," Otis declared, his voice hardening. "One who builds and one who takes. One who honors his father and mother, and one who stands in the shadows, judging the very hands that fed her." He was talking about me. He was publicly flaying me alive at his own anniversary party. "Sophia," he said, saying my name like it was a curse. He didn't ask me to stand, but the weight of the attention forced me to straighten my spine. "I have spent years trying to mold you, trying to help you find your way." He continued, looking at me with a mixture of pity and disdain. "I have prayed for your heart to soften. I have paid for your mistakes. But a father can only do so much. There comes a time when you have to prune the dead branches so the tree can survive." Gasps echoed through the room. The cruelty of the metaphor was shocking even for him. He was calling me a dead branch, a parasite. Tonight, in front of God and these witnesses, I am making a decision for the good of this family's future. Otis announced, his voice booming with finality. "I am announcing that effective immediately, the entirety of the Brooks family holdings, including all real estate liquid assets and future ventures, will be placed into a trust under the sole control of Marcus Brooks." He paused for effect, letting the words sink in. "Sophia, you have chosen your path of mediocrity and bitterness, and I release you to it. You will receive no shares. You will have no seat on the board. You are free to live the small life you seem to desire so much without the burden of the legacy you are too weak to carry." The room erupted, but it wasn't the applause of celebration this time. It was a chaotic mix of shock whispers and yes applause from the sycophants who wanted to stay on Otis's good side. I saw Jessica clapping wildly, her eyes gleaming with triumph. I saw Marcus smirking, raising his glass to me in a mock toast. But mostly I saw the faces of the guests. They looked at me with pity. They looked at me like I was a tragedy, a discard. The black sheep who had finally been sheared and cast out into the cold. I sat there bathed in the harsh white light and I felt nothing. No shame, no sorrow. Because they didn't know. They didn't know that the company Otis had just gifted to Marcus was actually a shell corporation filled with $12 million of toxic debt. They didn't know that by signing over 100% of the holdings, Otis had just legally transferred full liability for the tax fraud and the loans to his beloved son. He hadn't given Marcus a crown. He had given him a prison sentence. And he had just publicly, legally, and loudly absolved me of any connection to the sinking ship. I looked at my father on stage posturing like a king. He thought he was cutting me off. He thought he was punishing me. In reality, he had just handed me the greatest gift of my life. He had given me a clean break. I slowly reached for my water glass. The spotlight was still on me. The room was still staring. I raised the glass slightly in my father's direction, a small, imperceptible gesture. "Thank you," I mouthed. Otis didn't see it. He was too busy basking in the applause, hugging Marcus again. The photographer next to me leaned in, whispering, "Jesus, lady, are you okay?" That was brutal. I turned to him, and for the first time that night, my smile reached my eyes. "I am better than okay," I whispered back. "I am free." I looked down at my phone under the table. The transfer of the deed to the venue was complete. The foreclosure notice had been sent to the hotel management system. I watched the time on the screen. 8:58 p.m. 2 minutes until the system rebooted. 2 minutes until the lights went out. 2 minutes until the king realized he was standing in my castle. The speech was over. The applause was dying down. But the real show was just about to start. The applause from my father's speech had barely faded into a low, judgmental murmur when a piercing scream shattered the atmosphere. It was a sound so sharp and theatrical that for a moment I thought it was part of the entertainment, perhaps an opera singer hired to serenade the newly crowned prince. But then I saw Jessica. She had leapt up from the head table, her chair scraping violently against the marble floor and toppling over with a deafening crash. She was clutching her left hand with her right, her eyes wide with a panic that looked almost convincing if you didn't know her as well as I did. "Oh my God!" she shrieked, her voice cracking perfectly on the last syllable. "It is gone. My ring, my wedding ring, is gone." The room froze. The waiters stopped pouring wine. The jazz band faltered and went silent. All eyes turned to the hysterical woman in the gold-sequined dress, who was now frantically patting the tablecloth, knocking over crystal glasses in her feigned desperation. Red wine spilled across the pristine white linen like a fresh wound, but Jessica didn't care. "It was a 5-carat diamond," she wailed, looking directly at the cameras that were still rolling. "It is a family heirloom. It was on my finger 5 minutes ago." Otis rushed to her side, his face a mask of concern. "Everyone stay calm!" he bellowed into the microphone, taking charge of the situation. "Nobody move. We will find it. It must have slipped off." "No!" Jessica cried, shaking her head wildly. "It didn't slip off. It fits perfectly. Someone took it. Someone stole it." She spun around, her eyes scanning the room like a predator seeking the weakest member of the herd. I sat perfectly still at table 19, sipping my water, watching the performance with a detached curiosity. I knew exactly where this was going. Jessica needed a climax to her drama. She needed a villain to cement her status as the victim, and my father had just primed the audience to despise me. It was almost too easy. Her gaze locked onto me across the room. She pointed a trembling finger in my direction, her red nail polish looking like a drop of blood at the end of a spear. Her Jessica screamed. It was Sophia. A collective gasp went through the room. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. "She was standing right next to me earlier," Jessica shouted, playing to the crowd. "When she came up to the stage with that envelope, she grabbed my wrist. Remember, she grabbed my hand. She must have slipped it off then. She is the only one who has touched me all night." The accusation was ludicrous. I had grabbed her wrist, yes, but that was 20 minutes ago. If the ring had been missing, then she would have noticed the weight difference immediately. But logic has no place in a witch hunt. The crowd, already manipulated by my father's speech about my jealousy and greed, turned on me instantly. I could hear the whispers rising like a tide. "Of course she did it. She is broke. She is jealous. She wanted to ruin the night." Otis looked at me. For a second I saw hesitation in his eyes. He knew I wasn't a thief. He knew I had never stolen a penny in my life. But then he looked at Marcus, who was looking at him with expectation. He looked at the investors who were waiting to see how the patriarch would handle a criminal in the family. He made a choice. He chose the lie over the truth, just as he had done every day for the last 30 years. Security Otis barked, his voice cold and authoritative. "Seize her." Two large men in dark suits who had been standing by the exit began to march toward table 19. The guests parted like the Red Sea, pulling their chairs away from me, as if I carried a contagious disease. Otis spoke into the microphone again, his voice echoing with righteous anger. "I will not tolerate thievery in this house. I don't care who she is. If she has that ring, I want her arrested. I have no daughter who is a criminal." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. He had just authorized the public violation of his own child to save face. The security guards reached my table. The first one, a man with a thick neck and eyes that held no sympathy, loomed over me. "Ma'am, stand up," he ordered. I stood up slowly, deliberately. I didn't rush. I smoothed the front of my black silk dress. I picked up my clutch from the table. "Empty the bag," the guard commanded, holding out a coarse, calloused hand. I opened the clutch and turned it upside down. My phone, a lipstick, and a few mints fell into his palm. He shook the bag, checking for hidden compartments, then tossed it back onto the table with a sneer. "Nothing in the bag," he grunted to Otis. "Check her pockets," Jessica screamed from the stage. "Check her dress. She probably slipped it down her bra. She is trash. She would do anything to hide it." The guard looked at me. "Spread your arms," he said. This was the moment where I was supposed to cry. This was the moment where I was supposed to beg my father to stop, to scream that I was innocent, to cause a scene that would justify their hatred. But I refused to give them that satisfaction. I stepped away from the table into the aisle where everyone could see me. I lifted my chin, staring directly at my father on the stage. And then, with the grace of a queen facing a firing squad, I slowly raised my arms out to the sides. I stood there crucified by their judgment, my face a mask of terrifying calm. "Go ahead," I said, my voice soft but steady enough to be heard in the deathly silence of the room. "Search me, but be very careful, because once you touch me, there is no going back." The guard hesitated for a split second, unnerved by my lack of fear. But Otis nodded impatiently, urging him on. The guard stepped forward. He patted down the sides of my dress. His hands were rough and intrusive, checking the seams, checking the hem. He moved to my back, checking the zipper line. It was a violation. It was humiliating. Every second felt like an hour. I could feel the heat of 300 gazes burning into my skin, stripping away my dignity layer by layer. I saw the smirk on Jessica's face. I saw the relief on Marcus's face. They thought this was the end of me. But as the guard's hands moved over the fabric of my dress, I wasn't thinking about the shame. I was thinking about the time. 9:00 p.m. The guard pulled back, looking confused. He looked at his partner, then up at Otis. He shook his head. "She is clean, sir," the guard announced. "There is no ring." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's jaw dropped. She touched her necklace, her chest checking to see if she had hidden it on herself, and forgotten panic flaring in her eyes for real this time. She had clearly staged this, likely hiding the ring in her own purse or under the tablecloth, expecting them to find something on me, or at least to drag me out before the truth came out. Otis looked furious, not because I was innocent, but because the show had failed. "Check again," he demanded. "She must have dropped it under the table." I lowered my arms. "I didn't fix my dress. I just looked at my father." "Are you done?" I asked. Otis glared at me. "Get out," he spat. "I don't care if you have it or not. You are a disruption. You are a curse on this family. Get out of my sight before I have you thrown out." I smiled. It was a small, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I am not going anywhere, Otis," I said, and then before he could respond, the room went black. Not just dim, pitch black. The chandeliers flickered and died. The stage lights cut out. The music stopped abruptly with a groan of dying power. The only light left came from the emergency exit signs, casting a ghostly green glow over the confused crowd. Screams of surprise erupted from the guests. I heard glass breaking. I heard Jessica shrieking for someone to turn the lights back on. In the darkness, I reached for my phone on the table. The screen illuminated my face, casting long shadows across my features. I looked like a ghost. I looked like vengeance. I tapped the screen one last time. The backup generator kicked in, but not for the house lights. It powered only the massive LED screen behind the stage. It flickered to life, blindingly bright in the dark room. But it didn't show the montage of Marcus's childhood photos anymore. It showed a logo, a golden sun rising over a shield, Helios Capital, and below it in bold red letters, "Property seized. All guests must vacate immediately." The crowd gasped. Otis spun around to look at the screen, his face bathed in the red light of his own destruction. I picked up my clutch and walked toward the center of the room. The security guards, confused and blinded by the sudden change in lighting, stepped back to let me pass. "You wanted to find the owner of this mess?" I said, my voice projecting clearly in the stunned silence. I walked until I was standing in the pool of light reflected from the screen. "You were looking for a thief," I said, looking up at my father, who was trembling on the stage. "But you were searching the wrong person. The only thieves in this room are standing on that stage, and I am here to collect what they stole." The security guard didn't just empty my bag. He desecrated it. With a rough, impatient jerk of his wrist, he turned the silk clutch upside down and shook it over the white tablecloth as if he were trying to shake a confession out of an inanimate object. The contents tumbled out in a humiliating cascade, landing with a series of small, pathetic sounds that seemed to echo in the silent ballroom. A tube of lipstick rolled away until it hit a wine glass. A pack of breath mints clattered next to a crumpled tissue. My phone landed face down with a dull thud. And then finally came the item that made a sound heavier than all the rest combined. It was a thick, cream-colored document folder sealed with a red wax stamp and bound with a navy blue ribbon. It hit the table with a solid, authoritative slap that sounded like a judge's gavel. The guard stared at the pile of debris, using the tip of his finger to push the mints aside, hunting for the sparkle of a 5-carat diamond. He patted the empty bag one last time, flattening it against the table, before looking up at my father with a mixture of disappointment and annoyance. "There is nothing here," Mr. Brooks, the guard, announced, his voice devoid of the triumph he had expected. "No ring, just junk." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. I saw Jessica's face fall. She had been so sure, so ready to see the glint of her jewelry being pulled from my possession. She took a step back, her hand flying to her throat, realizing that her script had just gone off the rails. If the ring wasn't on me, then the narrative of Sophia the thief was crumbling before it could even be fully built. Otis looked furious. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about the resolution. He needed a culprit, and I was failing to cooperate even in my own framing. "Check the lining," Jessica screeched, desperate to salvage the moment. "Rip it open! She probably sewed it inside." The guard hesitated, looking at the expensive silk of my clutch. He reached for a small pocket knife on his belt, prepared to slice my property open on a hunch. But before he could cut, a hand reached out from the crowd and stopped him. Wait. It wasn't a family member. It was Mr. Henderson, the president of the First National Bank of Fairfield, one of the men my father had been trying to impress all night. He was a man who smelled of old money and risk assessment, and right now he was staring at the table with a look of absolute horror. He wasn't looking at the lipstick. He wasn't looking at the phone. He was staring at the thick folder that the guard had ignored. He stepped closer, his eyes wide, fixed on the gold foil logo embossed on the front of the folder. A stylized sun rising over a shield. "Otis," Mr. Henderson whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He looked up at my father, his face draining of color, leaving him looking gray and sickly under the stage lights. "Why does your daughter have a dossier from Helios Capital?" Otis frowned, looking down at the folder with disdain. He didn't recognize the logo. To him it was just paperwork. He didn't read financial news. He didn't track market shifts. He just signed whatever his accountants put in front of him. "Helios who?" Otis grunted, waving his hand dismissively. "I don't know what that is. Probably some junk mail she picked up. Or maybe a job application. She is always looking for handouts." Mr. Henderson didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He looked at Otis as if he were a man standing on train tracks who refused to acknowledge the whistle of the oncoming locomotive. "Otis, listen to me," Henderson hissed, grabbing my father's arm and pulling him slightly away from the microphone, though not far enough to hide the panic in his posture. "Helios Capital isn't a place you apply for a job. They are the apex predators of the financial world. They are the shark fund. They just spent $300 million buying up every toxic debt portfolio in the state. They don't negotiate. They liquidate." I stood perfectly still, watching the blood drain from my father's face as the words slowly sank in. Toxic debt, liquidation, words he knew all too well. Henderson pointed a shaking finger at the folder on the table. "That's stamp, confidential. That isn't public record, Otis. That is an internal acquisition file. That is the kind of file you only see if you are the one pulling the trigger." Otis looked at the folder, then at me. For a second, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He looked at his daughter, the girl in the plain black dress, the girl he had just disowned, and tried to connect her to the terrifying entity Mr. Henderson was describing, but his ego wouldn't let him. His arrogance was a wall too high to climb. He couldn't conceive of a world where I had power over him. It was easier to believe I was a failure than to accept I was a threat. "Don't be ridiculous," Jim Otis scoffed, pulling his arm away from the banker and forcing a laugh that sounded brittle and fake. "Look at her. Look at that dress. Look at that cheap bag. Does she look like a shark to you?" He gestured at me with open contempt. "She probably found that folder in a trash can," Otis sneered loud enough for the front tables to hear. "Or maybe she got a job as a janitor at their office cleaning the toilets. That is about the level of responsibility Sophia can handle. She is just trying to look important. It is pathetic, really." He turned back to the security guard, regaining his bluster. "Ignore the trash on the table. If the ring isn't in the bag, then she must have passed it to someone else. Or she swallowed it. I want her escorted off the premises immediately. Take her to the police station and let them deal with it. I want her out of my sight." Mr. Henderson looked at me again. He didn't see a janitor. He saw the stillness in my posture. He saw the cold, hard intelligence in my eyes. He backed away slowly, retreating into the crowd, as if he wanted to put as much distance between himself and my father as possible. He knew what was coming. He knew that you don't mistake a shark for a goldfish just because the water is murky. I watched him go. Smart man. The guard reached for my arm again. "Let's go, miss. Don't make a scene." I didn't move. I looked at the folder on the table. My name wasn't on the cover. But inside, on the very first page in bold letters, was the name of the new owner of the Vantage Point estate. I reached out and placed my hand on the folder. The guard tried to slap my hand away, but I was faster. I picked it up. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "I do clean up messes." I looked at the folder, then back at him. "But I am not the janitor. I am the executioner." And with that, I opened the file. The first page wasn't a job application. It was a deed transfer. And as I turned it around to face the room, the logo of Helios Capital seemed to glow under the emergency lights, signaling the end of the Brooks dynasty and the beginning of mine. The folder lay on the table between us, a heavy cream-colored slab of reality that my father refused to acknowledge. He was still posturing, still trying to wave away the iceberg that had just ripped through the hull of his titanic ego. He turned his back on me, dismissing the dossier as a prop, and gestured wildly to the band to start playing again, desperate to drown out the awkward silence with noise. But the music didn't start. The conductor was staring at Mr. Henderson, the banker, who had fled the scene, and then at me. He was smart enough to know that when the rats jump ship, the vessel is already going down. I didn't try to argue with Otis anymore. There was no point in shouting over a man who had spent a lifetime listening only to the sound of his own voice. Instead, I reached for my phone. It was the same motion I had made in the teaser the moment that started this entire story, but now you understand the weight behind it. My hand wasn't trembling from fear anymore. It was trembling with the sheer electric intensity of what I was about to unleash. I unlocked the screen. The interface of the Helios Capital Asset Management app was stark and simple. Dark mode, gray text, and a series of command prompts that controlled the infrastructure of the buildings we acquired. To my family, a phone was a device for social media and selfies. To me, it was a remote control for the physical world. I navigated to the Property tab. The Vantage Point estate. Status defaulted. Ownership transfer complete. I tapped the sub-menu labeled Infrastructure Control. On the stage, Otis was tapping the microphone, the feedback whining shrilly. "Is this thing on? Let's get some music going, people. We are celebrating a legacy here." I looked down at my screen. A small dialog box had popped up. It asked for a biometric confirmation to override the venue's master system. I pressed my thumb against the glass. The little circle spun green. Access granted. There it was. The button. It wasn't big or flashy. It was just a simple rectangular command prompt that read, "Execute foreclosure protocol." I looked up at my father one last time. He was smiling again, that fake plastered-on grin, raising a glass of champagne to a room that was no longer his. He looked so small from where I stood. So fragile. He thought power was a microphone and a spotlight. He didn't know that real power is the ability to turn them both off. I didn't hesitate. I didn't blink. I pressed the button. The effect was instantaneous and violent. There was a loud, heavy clunk, like the sound of a giant metal door slamming shut, deep within the bowels of the building. It was the sound of the main circuit breakers tripping in unison. And then the world ended. The crystal chandeliers overhead, which had been bathing the room in golden warmth, died instantly. The stage lights cut out, swallowing my father into the darkness. The hum of the air conditioning, a sound so constant you forget it is there, until it is gone, sputtered and vanished. The room was plunged into an abyss. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. A silence so heavy and sudden that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then the panic set in. Screams erupted from the darkness. I heard the crash of a tray of glasses hitting the floor as a waiter stumbled. I heard Jessica shrieking, her voice high and terrified. "Otis! Otis, what is happening? We are under attack!" My father's voice came out of the darkness, but without the amplification of the microphone, he sounded pathetic and thin. "Stay calm. It is just a fuse. Someone get a flashlight. Where is the manager?" But no manager came. Because the manager worked for me now. In the pitch black, the only light came from the glow of 300 cell phone screens that were suddenly lit up, casting ghostly pale shadows across frightened faces. People were holding their phones up like torches, their beams cutting through the gloom, revealing the confusion and fear on the faces of the elite. But the darkness wasn't the finale. It was just the curtain rise. A low electrical hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. The backup generator kicked in. But per the protocol I had just executed, the power wasn't routed to the lights. It wasn't routed to the sound system. It was routed to a single output. The massive LED screen behind the stage, which had previously been displaying a slideshow of Marcus's life, flickered to life. But the smiling photos of my brother were gone. The screen washed the entire ballroom in a deep, aggressive, blood-red glow. It was blindingly bright in the darkened room, forcing the guests to squint and shield their eyes. The red light bathed everything in a sinister hue. It made the spilled wine look like blood. It made the guests look like demons. And in the center of that massive red screen, bold black letters began to type out one by one, accompanied by a digital keystroke sound that echoed through the silent room. "Property seized." The words hung there, massive and undeniable. The typing continued. "Foreclosure executed by Helios Capital." And then the final line, flashing slowly, "All unauthorized personnel must vacate premises immediately." The room went from confused to chaotic in seconds. The guests, realizing this wasn't a technical glitch, but a legal enforcement, began to scramble. Chairs were knocked over. People were pushing toward the exits, their phone flashlights bobbing wildly in the red haze. On the stage, silhouetted against the giant red screen, my father looked like a man trapped in hell. He was staring up at the words, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. The red light cast long, terrifying shadows across his face, highlighting every wrinkle of age and every ounce of terror. Marcus was trying to hide behind him, shielding his face from the light, as if the screen itself could burn him. Jessica was on her knees trying to gather her skirt, looking around for someone to blame, someone to yell at, but there was no one left to listen. I stood perfectly still in the center of the storm. The red light washed over me, but I didn't feel afraid. I felt authorized. I looked at my phone again. A new notification popped up. "Protocol active. NYPD dispatched for eviction assistance. ETA 4 minutes." I slipped the phone back into my bag. The chaos around me was a symphony of my own composition. The screaming, the running, the shouting. It was the sound of a false kingdom crumbling to dust. Otis finally found his voice. He ran to the edge of the stage, screaming into the darkness, his face purple in the red glow. This is a mistake. This is a hack. Someone turn this off. Sophia, where are you? I know you did this. His voice was raw, stripping away the polished preacher persona, revealing the scared, angry man beneath. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The screen was doing all the talking for me. I simply turned and began to walk toward the main exit, the crowd parting for me, not out of respect, but out of fear. In the red light with my black dress flowing around me, I must have looked like the angel of death they had all been warned about. The party wasn't just over, it was extinguished. And as I pushed open the double doors, letting the cool night air hit my face, I heard the distant wail of police sirens approaching. The cleanup crew had arrived. The heavy double doors swung open with a synchronized precision that commanded attention even amidst the chaos. The red emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows across the entryway, but the group of men who stepped through were not the police officers my father had been screaming for. They were something far more terrifying to a man who had built his life on debt and deception. They were corporate lawyers. Leading the phalanx was Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the Vantage Point estate. For years, my father had treated Sterling like a glorified butler, snapping fingers at him to fetch better wine, or complaining about the temperature of the soup. But tonight, Sterling looked different. He wasn't wearing his usual hotel uniform. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit that cost more than Marcus's leased Mercedes. Flanking him were 5 other men carrying leather briefcases, their expressions carved from granite. They moved into the room with the unstoppable momentum of a tidal wave, parting the sea of panicked guests who scrambled to get out of their path. Otis, seeing a familiar face, lunged forward from the edge of the stage. He looked like a madman, his tuxedo disheveled, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic hope. Sterling Otis screamed, waving his arms wildly. "Thank God you are here. This is a disaster. The system has been hacked. Someone turned off the lights and put this garbage on the screen. It is her. It is Sophia. I want you to arrest her. I want her thrown out of here immediately." My father reached out to grab Sterling's arm, expecting the usual deferential treatment, expecting the man to bow and scrape and apologize for the inconvenience. But Sterling didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He didn't even blink. He walked past Otis as if my father were made of smoke. He didn't acknowledge. The screaming man didn't look at the outstretched hand, didn't offer a single word of comfort. The breeze from his passing suit jacket was the only response Otis got. My father was left grasping at empty air, stumbling forward, his mouth falling open in sheer confusion. He turned, watching Sterling walk away from him, and for the first time the reality of his irrelevance began to dawn on him. Sterling walked straight toward the center of the room, straight toward the pool of red light where I was standing. The 5 lawyers followed in lockstep, forming a protective semicircle around us. The room fell into a hush that was heavier and more suffocating than the darkness. The guests stopped running. The screaming stopped. Everyone froze, sensing that the apex predator had just entered the ecosystem. Sterling stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. He brought his heels together with a sharp click. And then, in front of the entire assembly of Fairfield's elite, in front of the parents who had called me a beggar and the brother who had called me useless, Mr. Sterling bent at the waist. It wasn't a nod. It wasn't a casual greeting. It was a deep, formal 90-degree bow of absolute respect and submission. He held the position for a long, agonizing second, letting the image burn into the retinas of everyone watching. When he straightened up, he didn't look at me with the pity I was used to receiving in this town. He looked at me with reverence. "Good evening, Chairwoman Brooks," Sterling said, his voice clear and projecting to the back of the silent room. The title hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Chairwoman. Not Sophia. Not the daughter. Chairwoman. I apologize for the delay in the transition protocol. Sterling continued, his tone professional and crisp. My team has secured the perimeter. The local police are holding the outer gates to ensure no unauthorized assets leave the property. We have also locked down the administrative offices as you requested. He paused, glancing briefly over his shoulder at the stage where my family stood, frozen in a tableau of horror, before turning his eyes back to me. "We are awaiting your command, Chairwoman. How do you wish to proceed with the trespassers currently occupying the stage?" The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. I looked past Sterling to the stage. Otis looked like he had been struck by lightning. His face was a mask of gray shock, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The word chairwoman was bouncing around his skull, shattering every perception he had held for 30 years. Beatrice had collapsed into a chair, clutching her chest, her eyes bulging as she stared at the man she had treated like a servant, now bowing to the daughter she had treated like dirt. Marcus was gripping the podium, his knuckles white. He looked from Sterling to me, and I saw the moment his world fractured. He looked at the folder on the table, the one he had mocked, and realized that the janitor joke was the noose around his own neck. And Jessica. Jessica was the most satisfying of all. She was standing frozen, one hand still clutching her empty ring finger, her face drained of all color. She looked at Sterling, then at me, and I saw the terror of a woman who realizes she has just declared war on a nuclear power. I didn't answer Sterling immediately. I let them marinate in the fear. I let the word trespassers sink into their bones. They weren't the hosts anymore. They weren't the guests of honor. They were intruders in my house. I slowly walked over to a nearby table where a bottle of vintage Cabernet, one of the few bottles Marcus had actually managed to open before his card was declined, was sitting. I picked up a clean glass. I poured the wine, the dark red liquid swirling in the glass, matching the ominous glow of the screen behind me. I took a sip. It was full-bodied, complex, and tasted like victory. I turned to Sterling. "Have the legal team prepare the eviction notices for immediate service," I said calmly. "But first, I have a speech to finish." I walked past Sterling. I walked past the stunned guests, who parted from me with terrified awe. I walked toward the stage. My family shrank back as I approached. Otis took a stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over a monitor. Marcus hid behind his mother. They looked at me as if I were a monster rising from the deep. I climbed the stairs. The sound of my heels on the wood was rhythmic and deliberate. Click, click, click. I walked to the center of the stage, standing right next to the podium that Marcus had used to brag about his leased car. I stood under the giant red screen that declared my ownership. I looked out at the crowd. At the bankers, the pastors, the neighbors who had laughed at me an hour ago. They were all looking up at me now, their faces pale in the red light, waiting for judgment. I raised my wineglass in a mock toast to my father, who was cowering in the shadows of the wings. Then I looked directly into the camera that was still live streaming to the internet, the same feed Jessica had set up to show off her wealth. I smiled. "Welcome to my party," I said softly. The red light pulsed once and I took another sip of wine. "Now let's talk about the rent." I stood at the podium, the smell of my father's expensive cologne still lingering on the microphone he had abandoned. The room was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that usually precedes a sentencing. I looked down at the family who had spent 30 years treating me like an overhead cost they couldn't wait to cut. They were huddled together at the foot of the stairs, looking up at me, not with love, but with the terrified realization that the balance of power had shifted permanently. I placed my wineglass on the lectern and pulled a small remote control from my pocket. It was time to open the books. "You spoke so eloquently about legacy tonight, Father," I said, my voice amplified clearly through the emergency sound system. "You told everyone here that you built a kingdom. You told them that Marcus is inheriting an empire. But you left out the most important part of the story. You forgot to mention that the kingdom is built on quicksand." I pressed the button on the remote. The massive LED screen behind me shifted. The red warning text dissolved, replaced by a high-resolution image of a bank statement. It was dated 2 years ago. The numbers were large enough for everyone in the back row to see, and they were all in parentheses. Red negative numbers. "This is the balance sheet for Brooks Enterprises. From October 2021, I announced, using the laser pointer to circle the bottom line. As you can see, the company has been technically insolvent for 24 months. You haven't made a profit since I left for college. Otis stepped forward, his face purple. That is a lie, he shouted, though his voice lacked its usual boom. That is doctored. We had a bad quarter. Everyone has bad quarters. I clicked the button again. A new document appeared. This one wasn't a bank statement. It was a promissory note handwritten on a napkin, photographed and notarized. Is this also a lie, I asked? This is a loan agreement signed by you, Otis Brooks, to a private lender known on the street as Vinny the Shark. You borrowed $200,000 at 40% interest to pay for the remodel of this very house. You are not living on profits, Dad. You are living on borrowed time. You are paying one loan shark with money from another. And as of this morning, when Helios Capital bought your debt portfolio, you don't owe Vinny anymore. You owe me. And unlike Vinny, I don't break legs. I seize assets. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bankers in the room were nodding, recognizing the truth they had suspected, but never confirmed. Otis slumped against the stage, the fight draining out of him. He looked old. He looked defeated. I turned my gaze to my mother. Beatrice was trembling, clutching her pearl necklace as if it were a rosary. And you, Mother, I said softly. The woman who cares so much about appearances. The woman who just slapped me in the hallway because I refused to fund your delusion. I clicked the remote. The screen changed again. This time it showed two signatures side by side. One was shaky and elegant, my grandmother Dorothy's signature from her 1990 will. The other was sharp, angular, and clearly forced the signature on the deed transfer dated 3 days ago. You told Jessica you sold Grandma's cottage to pay for this party? I continued, my voice hardening. But Grandma didn't sign that deed, did she? She couldn't have, because she has been dead for 5 years. Beatrice let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. What you did is called forgery. Mother, I explained to the silent room, and because you used the U.S. mail to send the fraudulent documents to the county clerk, it is also wire fraud. That is a federal crime. I have already submitted this forensic handwriting analysis to the FBI. The agent in charge was very interested to learn how a dead woman signed away her property to pay for a party she would have hated. Beatrice collapsed onto the floor, her silver dress pooling around her like a puddle of mercury. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. The evidence was 10 feet tall and glowing behind me. Finally, I looked at Marcus, the golden child, the CEO. He was shaking his head, backing away, trying to hide behind his wife. But there was nowhere to hide. And Marcus, I said, my voice dripping with disdain. My dear brother, the man who needs a Mercedes to feel like a man. I clicked the remote one last time. The screen filled with a series of wire transfers. They were all from the corporate account to a company called Sapphire Consulting. For 5 years you have been draining the company accounts to pay consulting fees to this firm, I said. 3,000 here, 5,000 there. It adds up to over $400,000. I looked at Jessica. She was staring at the screen, confused. Jessica, have you ever met the consultant from Sapphire? I asked. Jessica shook her head slowly. No. I clicked the remote again. A photo appeared. It was a selfie of a young woman, barely 21, standing in front of a mirror in a luxury apartment. She was wearing a familiar-looking diamond necklace. This is Sapphire, I revealed. Her real name is Candy, and that apartment she is standing in, the rent, is paid by Sapphire Consulting. In tax terms, Marcus, this is called embezzlement. In legal terms, it is tax evasion. But in marriage terms, I believe it is called funding your mistress with your wife's inheritance. The scream that came out of Jessica's mouth was primal. She turned on Marcus, her eyes wild. You gave her my necklace, she shrieked, clawing at his face. You told me it was being repaired. You gave it to a stripper. Marcus tried to fend her off, shouting, begging. It is not what it looks like. Sophia is lying. It is exactly what it looks like. I interrupted, my voice cutting through their domestic violence. I turned off the screen. The room plunged back into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the emergency lights and the flashes of cell phone cameras recording the downfall of the Brooks family. I looked down at them. My father, the bankrupt fraud. My mother, the felon. My brother, the thief and adulterer. And Jessica, the fool who married into a mirage. I audited the books I said, closing the folder on the podium. And I found that you are all morally, financially, and legally bankrupt. I picked up my wine glass again. Mr. Sterling, I called out to the general manager who was standing guard. Yes, chairwoman, I believe the police have arrived, I said, gesturing to the flashing blue lights visible through the glass doors. Please escort these trespassers to the awaiting officers. They have a lot of questions to answer. And Sterling, yes, chairwoman, make sure they don't take the silverware on their way out. The sound of a 5-carat diamond hitting a marble floor is surprisingly loud when the rest of your world has gone silent. It was a sharp, distinct clatter that signaled the end of a marriage and the beginning of a war. Jessica did not just take the ring off, she weaponized it. With a scream that tore through her throat, she hurled the heavy platinum band directly at Marcus's face. It struck him on the cheekbone just below his eye, leaving a red welt that began to swell immediately, matching the hue of the emergency lights bathing the room. You are a fraud! Jessica shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that made the remaining guests cover their ears. You told me you were a millionaire. You told me this family owned half the state. You lied to me. You made me look like a fool in front of the entire city. Marcus stumbled back, clutching his face, his other hand reaching out to her in a pathetic gesture of reconciliation. Jessica, please, he stammered, his voice thick with panic. Baby, listen to me. It is a misunderstanding. Sophia is manipulating the numbers. We can fix this. Fix this. Jessica laughed, a manic, terrifying sound. How are you going to fix grand larceny, Marcus? How are you going to fix tax evasion? And how exactly are you going to fix the fact that you spent my inheritance on a 21-year-old Instagram model named Sapphire? She lunged at him, her manicured nails raking across the lapels of his tuxedo jacket. I saw the pictures, Marcus. Everyone saw them. You bought that trash a condo while you were telling me we had to budget for a vacation. You stole from me. You stole from your parents. You are not a CEO. You are a parasite. She shoved him hard, and for a man who had always walked with such arrogant stability, he went down easily. He stumbled over the train of his mother's dress and fell onto the stage, landing in a heap of expensive fabric and shattered ego. I am done, Jessica announced, turning to the crowd, playing to the cameras of the guests who were still recording. I am filing for an annulment in the morning. I am a victim here. I didn't know about the fraud. I was deceived just like the rest of you. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a moment of solidarity, hoping that by throwing him under the bus, she could save herself from the wreckage. I just stared back at her, my face impassive. She was a rat deserting a sinking ship, but she forgot that she had helped chew the holes in the hull. Get away from me, she hissed at Marcus, who was trying to grab the hem of her dress. Don't you dare touch me with those hands. I hope you rot in prison. She turned on her heel and stormed down the stairs, pushing past the security guards, desperate to distance herself from the name Brooks before the handcuffs came out. Marcus lay on the stage for a moment, breathing heavily, the sound of his wife's heels fading into the distance. He looked around. Otis was slumped against the podium, staring at nothing, his mind broken by the reality of his failure. Beatrice was sobbing quietly on the floor, mourning the loss of her social status more than the loss of her integrity. Marcus was alone. The golden child had lost his shine. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up. He looked at the crowd, but there was no adoration left, only disgust. He looked at the exit, but the police lights were flashing against the glass. He realized, with the terrified clarity of a trapped animal, that there was only one person in the room who had the power to stop the bleeding. He turned to me. I stood there still holding my wine glass, watching him with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. Marcus crawled. He didn't walk. He crawled on his hands and knees across the few feet of stage that separated us. It was a grotesque display of desperation. Snot and tears were running down his face, mixing with the sweat and the red mark where the ring had hit him. "Sophia," he choked out, reaching for my hand. I took a step back, moving my silk dress out of his reach. "Sophia, please," he sobbed, looking up at me. "You can stop this. You have the power. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell the lawyers to go away. We can work this out." He tried to smile, a grotesque, wobbling expression. "We are family, right? We are blood. You and me against the world. Remember when we were kids? Remember when I taught you how to ride a bike?" I remembered. I remembered him pushing me into the bushes and laughing when I scraped my knees. I remembered him stealing my allowance. I remembered him standing by while my parents berated me for existing. "It wasn't me, Sophia," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "It was them. It was Mom and Dad. They pressured me. They made me live this lie. I didn't want the car. I didn't want the big office. They forced me to be the golden boy. I am a victim too, Sophia. I was just doing what they told me." He pointed a shaking finger at our parents, throwing them to the wolves just as Jessica had thrown him. "I am your brother," he wailed, burying his face in his hands. "Your big brother. You can't let them take me to jail. Please, little sister, have mercy." I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet. This was the man who had twisted my arm in the hallway an hour ago. This was the man who had called me useless. This was the man who had spent his entire life standing on my neck to make himself look taller. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, but it wasn't pity. It was revulsion. It was the physical sensation of shedding a skin that had been too tight for too long. "Stand up, Marcus," I said, my voice cold and hard as a diamond. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "You will help me." I said, "Stand up," I repeated. "You are ruining your suit, and since it is technically company property now, I don't want you damaging my assets." The hope in his eyes died, replaced by confusion. I took another sip of wine, savoring the silence of the room. "You have a very selective memory, Marcus. You asked me to remember when we were kids. But do you remember what you said to me an hour ago? You said I was nothing. You said nobody wanted me here. You said my career, my life meant nothing compared to your image." "I didn't mean it," he stammered. "I was stressed. I was drunk." "You meant every word," I corrected him. "Just like you meant it when you poured that wine on me earlier tonight. Just like you meant it when you let Dad call me a beggar on this stage." I leaned down, bringing my face close to his so he could see the absolute zero in my eyes. "And as for your request," I whispered loud enough for the microphone to catch. "You asked your little sister for mercy, but you are confused, Marcus." I straightened up and looked out at the audience, at the world that was watching. "You don't have a sister anymore." Marcus froze. "What?" "The girl you are looking for. The one named Sophia, who used to cry in her room and beg for your validation. She isn't here," I said, my voice rising with power. "She died tonight. She died the moment you poured that drink on her and laughed. She died the moment you threatened her in the hallway. You killed her, Marcus. You and Mom and Dad killed her with 1,000 tiny cuts over 30 years. I gestured to the red screen behind me, to the lawyers standing guard to the empire I had built in the shadows. "I am not your sister. I am the chairwoman of the board that holds your mortgage. I am the landlord of the house you live in. I am the owner of the car you drove here. And right now, I am the principal witness for the prosecution." Marcus stared at me, his mouth agape, realizing finally that there was no emotional lever left to pull. The bridge wasn't just burned. I had demolished the canyon it spanned. I turned to Sterling, who was watching with a grim satisfaction. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "I believe these guests have overstayed their welcome. Please remove them." Marcus lunged for my ankle, a final desperate attempt to drag me down with him. "Sophia, no." But before he could touch me, 2 security guards were on him. They hauled him up by his armpits, his feet dragging on the floor, his tuxedo bunching up around his shoulders. He kicked and screamed, a toddler in a man's body, finally facing the consequences of a lifetime of indulgence. I watched them drag him away, his screams echoing off the high ceilings. I didn't look away. I didn't feel guilty. I watched until the double doors swung shut behind him, cutting off his voice. I looked down at the spot where he had knelt. There was a wet patch of tears and sweat on the wood. "Goodbye, brother," I whispered. Then I turned back to the crowd, to the silent, terrified audience. "I trust the rest of you will check your own accounting before you judge someone by their dress," I said, "because you never know when the person you are laughing at is the one signing your checks." I raised my glass one last time. Meeting adjourned. The arrival of the authorities was not the polite, discreet affair my father had always envisioned for his interactions with the law. In Otis Brooks's mind, the police were people you met at charity galas or called to remove the homeless from your storefronts. They were instruments of his will, not agents of his destruction. But the men and women who marched through the double doors of the Vantage Point estate that night were not the local beat cops who looked the other way when Marcus got a speeding ticket. These agents wore navy blue windbreakers with bold yellow lettering on the back that read Economic Crimes Division. They moved with a synchronized predatory efficiency that sucked the remaining air out of the ballroom. Otis saw them coming, and for a fleeting second, his delusion kicked back in. He straightened his tie, smoothed his disheveled tuxedo jacket, and stepped forward to the edge of the stage, assuming the posture of the benevolent host greeting late arrivals. He truly believed even then that he could talk his way out of gravity. "Officers over here," he called out, his voice cracking slightly, but still carrying that tone of arrogant command. "Thank heavens you have arrived. We have a situation with a disgruntled family member who has hacked the audiovisual system. I need you to arrest the woman in the black dress standing in the center of the room for cyber-terrorism and trespassing." The lead agent, a tall woman with eyes like flint, didn't even break stride. She walked right past the spot where I was standing, ignoring my father's pointing finger. She marched up the stairs to the stage, her boots thudding heavily against the wood, a sound that echoed like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. She stopped inches from my father's face. He recoiled, offended by her proximity, opening his mouth to reprimand her. "Otis Brooks," she stated, her voice cutting through his bluster. "Yes, I am Mr. Brooks," he huffed, puffing out his chest. "And I demand that you are under arrest," she interrupted, pulling a pair of handcuffs from her belt. The metal caught the red light of the foreclosure screen, gleaming like blood. Otis froze. His brain simply could not compute the data. "Arrest me for what?" He sputtered, laughing nervously, looking out at the crowd for support. "This is a joke, a prank. Sophia, is this part of your little show? You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit money laundering," the agent recited, spinning him around with a force that made his expensive loafers skid on the floor. Otis let out a howl of indignation. "Get your hands off me. Do you know who I am? I am a pillar of this community. I am a man of God. I know the police commissioner. I will have your badge for this." "You can tell him all about it from the holding cell, Mr. Brooks," the agent said, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. The sound was sharp and final. Click, click. Otis began to thrash, his dignity evaporating instantly. He wasn't a patriarch anymore. He was a frightened animal. He looked out at the guests, his eyes wide and wild. "Help me. Don't just stand there, Jenkins Henderson. Tell them who I am. This is a setup. My daughter framed me. She is the criminal. Look at her. She is the devil." He screamed my name, spitting it out like poison, blaming me for the mathematical inevitability of his own greed. But the guests, the men and women who had eaten his food and drunk his wine for decades, didn't move. They stared at their shoes. They stared at the ceiling. They stared anywhere but at the man being dragged across the stage. While Otis was being manhandled, another officer approached Beatrice. My mother was still on the floor, surrounded by the pool of her silver gown clutching her chest. When she saw the officer looming over her, she held up a shaking hand, palm out, as if she could stop the law with a social cue. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am not well. I am having palpitations. I need a doctor. The officer wasn't moved. We have a paramedic waiting in the transport van, Mrs. Brooks. Stand up, please. Beatrice shook her head frantically. No, you don't understand. I didn't do anything. It was Otis. It was all Otis. He made me sign those papers. I didn't know what they were. I am just a wife. I just did what I was told. It was pathetic. The woman who had ruled her household with an iron fist, who had slapped me not an hour ago for defying her will, was now claiming to be a helpless victim of circumstance. We have your signature on the notary log, Mrs. Brooks, the officer said, reaching down to pull her up. You can explain your role to the district attorney. As the officer's hand closed around her arm, the reality finally pierced through Beatrice's denial. The shame of it, the public spectacle, the idea of being handcuffed in front of the Ladies' Auxiliary Committee members. It was too much for her fragile, constructed reality to bear. Her eyes rolled back in her head, her knees buckled. She didn't faint gracefully like they do in the movies. She collapsed with the heavy, dead weight of a sack of flour, her head hitting the stage with a dull thump. Mom Otis screamed, trying to break free from the agent holding him. You killed her, Sophia. You killed your mother. The officers didn't panic. They checked her pulse, confirmed she was breathing, and then with zero ceremony, two of them hoisted her up by her arms and dragged her across the stage, the toes of her silver heels dragging lifelessly across the floor. The procession was a grotesque parody of the grand entrance they had made earlier that evening. Otis was shouting threats and obscenities, his face purple with rage. Beatrice was being hauled out like discarded luggage, and through the glass doors of the main entrance illuminated by the flashing blue lights, the guests could see Marcus. He was already in the back of a squad car, pressing his face against the window, watching his parents join him in disgrace. He wasn't screaming anymore. He just looked hollow. I stood in the center of the room, sipping my wine, watching the family that had terrorized me for 30 years, being dismantled piece by piece. I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't joy exactly. It was the satisfaction of a ledger finally balancing out to zero. When the doors finally swung shut behind the last officer, leaving only the stunned silence of the guests, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The fear that had paralyzed the crowd began to dissolve, replaced by a desperate, cloying need for self-preservation. The guests, the elite of Fairfield, looked at each other, then at me. They saw the red screen. They saw the lawyers standing behind me, and they did what parasites always do when their host dies: they looked for a new one. Mrs. Vanderwall, the head of the local charity league, was the first to move. She was a woman who had once told me I wasn't presentable enough to volunteer at her fundraiser. Now she plastered a wide, trembling smile on her face and stepped toward me, her diamond earrings catching the red light. "Sophia, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "Oh my goodness, you poor thing. We had no idea. Absolutely no idea. To think they treated you so horribly all these years. It breaks my heart." She reached out as if to hug me. I didn't move, but my stare was cold enough to freeze her in her tracks. "We were just saying at our table," she continued, faltering slightly, "that you were always the smart one. The quiet dignity you have. It is remarkable. You know we are looking for a new treasurer for the gala next month. We would be honored, truly honored, if you would consider joining the board." Behind her, Councilman Jenkins cleared his throat. "Sophia, if there are any zoning issues with the property transfer, you just call my office directly. We can expedite the paperwork. We want to support legitimate business owners in this town." Suddenly, I was popular. Suddenly, I was Sophia, the brave Sophia, the smart Sophia, the victim. They crowded around the edge of the dance floor, offering apologies that cost them nothing, extending invitations that were 20 years too late. They thought they could distance themselves from Otis and Beatrice by aligning themselves with the conqueror. They thought I was one of them. I finished my glass of wine and set it down on a passing tray with a sharp clink. I looked at Mrs. Vanderwall, then at Jenkins, then at the sea of eager, treacherous faces. "Stop," I said. The word wasn't loud, but it silenced them instantly. "Do you think I am stupid?" I asked, looking from one face to another. "Do Do you think I have amnesia? Mrs. Vanderwall blinked. I don't understand. I remember my 16th birthday, I said, pointing at a table near the back. You were there, Mrs. Vanderwall. You watched my mother give Marcus a new car while I got a handshake. You laughed. You said it was good that I was learning my place early. I turned to the councilman. And you, Mr. Jenkins. When I applied for an internship at your office after college, you told my father you didn't want to hire the slow one. You asked if I could even type. I looked at the crowd. You were not innocent bystanders. You were the audience. You enabled them. You validated them. You ate their food, drank their wine, and laughed at their jokes while they dismantled my spirit. You didn't care about the fraud when it was buying you lobster tails. You only care now because the check bounced. I signaled to Sterling and the security team. I don't want your apologies. I don't want your board seats. And I certainly don't want your friendship. I checked my watch. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate my property. Anyone still on the premises after that will be considered a trespasser and will be joining my father in the back of a police van. The shock on their faces was almost as satisfying as the arrests. They had expected me to be grateful for their acceptance. They expected me to beg for entry into their club. They didn't realize I had just burned the clubhouse down. Get out! I shouted, my voice finally rising to match the red intensity of the screen. The stampede was immediate. There was no dignity left. Women grabbed their purses, men grabbed their coats, and they scrambled for the doors, like rats fleeing a flood. I watched them run, tripping over each other in their haste to escape the judgment of the girl they had ignored. Within 4 minutes, the ballroom was empty. The floor was littered with overturned chairs, spilled wine, and the debris of a shattered social hierarchy. I stood alone in the silence. The only sound was the hum of the backup generator. Mr. Sterling approached me quietly. The room is clear, chairwoman. I looked around the cavernous, empty hall. It looked different now. It didn't look like a prison anymore. It looked like a blank canvas. Thank you, Sterling, I said. Lock the doors and kill the red light. I think we have made our point. As the screen faded to black, leaving me in the peaceful dark, I finally let out the breath I had been holding for 30 years. The silence wasn't lonely. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The morning sun rose over Fairfield with a crisp, cleansing light that seemed to wash away the sins of the previous night. The air in the cemetery was still and cold, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. It was a stark contrast to the stifling heat and chaos of the ballroom, a contrast that I welcomed with every breath I took. I walked along the gravel path, the crunch of my boots, the only sound in the sanctuary of the dead. I wasn't wearing the black silk armor of the executioner anymore. Today I was dressed in a soft cream cashmere coat, a color that signaled peace, a color that signaled a new beginning. I stopped in front of a modest granite headstone nestled under the shade of an old oak tree. The inscription was simple. Dorothy Vance. Beloved mother and grandmother, the woman who had saved me, the woman who had whispered secrets of self-worth into my ear while my parents were too busy praising Marcus to notice I was in the room. I reached into my bag, but this time I wasn't pulling out a weapon or a foreclosure notice. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, the corners slightly worn from how tightly I had held onto it during the storm. It was the deed to the Victorian cottage on Elm Street, the house where I had learned to read, the house where I had felt safe. My mother had stolen it, leveraged it, and tried to turn it into a party favor. But I had clawed it back. I knelt down on the damp grass, ignoring the stain it would leave on my expensive coat. I placed the paper on the cold stone of the grave, smoothing it out with a gentle hand. I got it back, Grandma. I whispered, my voice thick with an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel for years. It is yours again. It is ours. I traced the letters of her name on the stone. They are gone, Grandma. I stopped them. They can't hurt us anymore. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree, a soft sigh that felt like an answer. For the first time in 30 years, the knot of anxiety that lived permanently in my chest began to unravel. It was a physical sensation, a release of tension so profound that I almost felt lightheaded. I realized then how heavy the burden of their hatred had been. I had been carrying their expectations, their insults, and their neglect like a backpack filled with stones. And now, finally, I had set it down. The silence of the moment was broken by the soft, vibrating hum of my phone. I pulled it from my pocket. The caller ID displayed the name of my personal attorney. I stood up, wiping my eyes, and swiped to answer. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice steady. "Good morning, Chairwoman." His voice came through clear and professional. "I wanted to give you a brief update on the fallout from last night. The preliminary arraignment for your father and brother is set for Monday. Bail has been denied due to the flight risk associated with the offshore accounts we uncovered." "And my mother?" I asked, looking down at the grave. "She is currently under observation at the county hospital," Sterling replied. "But the doctors have cleared her for transfer to police custody by this afternoon. The fraud charges are sticking, Sophia. The district attorney is very impressed with the evidence file you compiled." I took a deep breath. "Good. And what about the other matter?" Sterling paused for a moment, and I could hear the shuffling of papers on his end. "Regarding Jessica," he said, "we have confirmation that she attempted to board a flight to Dubai early this morning using her maiden name. However, thanks to the alert we placed on the family assets, her passport was flagged at customs." I looked out across the rows of headstones, watching a hawk circle in the pale blue sky. "Did they catch her?" I asked. "They did," Sterling confirmed. "She was detained by airport security. The authorities are charging her with conspiracy, aiding and abetting, and possession of stolen property related to the jewelry she was wearing. She is currently being transported back to Fairfield. She was apparently quite vocal about her innocence, claiming she was a victim, but the wire transfers from her personal account to the shell company say otherwise." I allowed myself a small, grim smile. Jessica had wanted to travel the world. Now she would just in a transport van. "Thank you, Sterling," I said. "Keep me informed. And start the process of turning the Vantage Point estate into that foundation we discussed. I want it to be a shelter for displaced families. I want the house my father built to exclude people to become a place that welcomes them." "Consider it done," Chairwoman Sterling said. "Congratulations, Sophia. It is over." I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. It was over. The words echoed in my mind, simple and absolute. The war was finished. The generals were captured. The battlefield was mine. I bent down one last time and kissed the cold stone of my grandmother's grave. "Rest easy, Grandma," I whispered. "I have some living to do." I turned and walked back toward the cemetery gates. I didn't rush. I walked with the easy, long stride of a woman who answers to no one. Parked at the curb, gleaming in the morning light, was my car. It wasn't a rental. It wasn't a lease. It was a Bentley Continental GT in a deep midnight blue. It was a machine of power and elegance, a symbol of the success I had built while my family was busy laughing at me. I opened the heavy door and slid into the driver's seat. The smell of hand-stitched leather filled my senses. I pressed the start button, and the engine roared to life, a low, powerful growl that vibrated through the steering wheel. I adjusted the rearview mirror. For a second, I looked at my own reflection. I didn't see the scared little girl anymore. I didn't see the black sheep. I saw a survivor. I saw a victor. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. As I drove down the winding road that led away from the cemetery and back toward the city, I passed the turnoff that led to my parents' old house. The house where I had been ignored. The house that was now wrapped in police tape. I didn't turn my head. I didn't glance in the rearview mirror. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, where the skyline of the city rose like a promise of infinite possibility. I had spent so long looking back, trying to understand, trying to fix, trying to be enough. I was done looking back. The road ahead was wide open, I rolled down the window, letting the cold wind whip through my hair. I thought about the guests who had scrambled to apologize. I thought about Marcus kneeling on the floor. I thought about the look on my father's face when the lights went out. They had called me a beggar. They had called me a failure. They had tried to bury me, not realizing that I was a seed. And now the harvest had come. The sweetest revenge is not making them suffer, though they surely will. It is not about anger or shouting or lowering yourself to their level of cruelty. The sweetest revenge is simply taking the light they tried to steal from you and turning it up so high that it becomes a beacon. It is about letting them see you, really see you for the first time, right at the moment they realize they can no longer reach you. It is about standing in your truth, radiant and untouchable, while they are left stumbling in the darkness of their own lies. They wanted to see what I was worth. Now they know, and the price of admission was everything they had. My name is Sophia. I am not a daughter. I am not a sister. I am the architect of my own destiny. And this open road, this silence, this peace, this is my empire. Sophia's journey teaches us that the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. For years, she endured humiliation, not because she was weak, but because she was strategically building a foundation that no one could shake. Her silence wasn't submission, it was preparation. We learn that true power doesn't need to scream for attention or seek validation from those committed to misunderstanding us. The ultimate victory lies in knowing your own worth when the world tries to discount it. When you build your own empire in the shadows, you don't need to fight for a seat at their table, you can simply buy the building. If Sophia's silent victory resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Remember, living well isn't just revenge, it's freedom.